Well, joining us, he is the former French diplomat Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, Paris director, or director of the Paris Bureau, I should say, for the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
This call, it's not new. Let's boost European defense. We heard it way back when François Mitterrand was president.
It's a long traditional position in France.
Let's cut to the chase on this. The French have one aircraft carrier, which they share with the British. Being autonomous for your own defense, does Europe have the means to do it?
Well, exactly. The ambition is that there's a need to be autonomous, and France cannot be autonomous by itself. It's trying to be as autonomous as possible. It's trying to have a defense, a military that is able to act alone, but it knows that with its own national resources, this is not going to be enough, which is why Emmanuel Macron advocated for a European strategic autonomy, as he says, that is a European effort, coordinated effort for Europeans together to be able to do stuff without relying on, for instance, the United States.
And was it a turning point, that NATO summit we saw back in June in Helsinki?
It wasn't a turning point, but I would say it was one more nail in the coffin, as they say in French. It was one additional step which helped people being aware that there was a need to do things. That was the case both in countries like France, where there is this long traditional quest for being independent and autonomous, but also, as you alluded to, in Germany, country where, on the contrary, for a long time there was no debate. You had to rely on the US and the American security guarantee.
What irked people more on this side of the Atlantic? Donald Trump calling for the others to pay more for their dues to NATO, pay more on military spending, something that Barack Obama did as well, or his remarks on Russia?
I think actually the key defining thing is a third thing. It's Iran. The call to spend more on defense, actually Europeans have started to spend more defense before Trump was elected. After Ukraine, I think, was one really moment where a lot of Europeans decided to spend more on defense. And people are starting from different points. France is already quite ahead. The UK is much more advanced, above those 2%. Germany is coming from quite far, but everybody is more or less moving in the same direction. What has changed with the Iran sanctions issue is that it's not just the US saying we disagree with you and we let you alone, we leave you alone dealing with your own security issues, which has happened in the past, but it's we disagree with you and we're going to force our policy, our belief, our positions on you with those sanctions. Those so-called secondary sanctions, which are not just sanctions on Iran, but sanctions on European companies who would want to trade or to invest with or in Iran. And that is a big change, I would say. But obviously, it's an accumulation of different things. And NATO, for instance, for Germany is much more important than it is for France in its vision of what the relationship in terms of security and defense is with the US.
Before the Brexit referendum, the country that was closest to France is the UK. Indeed. Is that still going to be the case going forward?
You've heard Emmanuel Macron, when he spoke about this issue, not today, but in previous speeches, being very intransigent with the UK in terms of how you're going to negotiate the post-Brexit relationship with London. But actually, the one point on which he's been quite forthcoming and quite flexible is security and defense, because he knows that the UK has assets that none other EU partner has. But this is not going to be enough. So I think that the French strategy is both to get the UK on board and to develop within the EU a more robust appetite and effort for investment on defense, and for not just investment on defense in terms of having the military, but having the will to use it and to deploy it. One of the key initiatives of Macron on defense is what he called his European Intervention Initiative. It is outside of the EU, and in it you have both the UK and Germany and a few other countries. And I think that sums up quite well the fact that you need the EU, but from the French perspective, you also need the UK to be on board by some other channels and means.
Need the UK to be on board, and we remember that after Donald Trump had that fraught summit, NATO summit in Helsinki, he then went on for a fraught visit to the UK. Mm-hmm. What's your prediction as far as whether or not that goal of keeping close ties with the British?
Well, I don't think that those close ties are going to disappear overnight. And actually, if you listen to what Macron said, the part of the speech that you got is a part where he says there is no change in alliances. So it doesn't mean you want to get rid of the relation with the US. Actually, the French have a very good defense cooperation with the US. In Syria, against Daesh, in the Sahel, the French operation in the Sahel, Barkhane, really relies a lot on US support. So it's not about changing allies. For the UK, it's more or less the same. But again, the Iran issue, and that's not a good example because it shows it's not just about defense, it's also about security. The Iran issues has the same impact in the UK that it has in France. And so the British know that this is a good example of an issue where they rely mostly on cooperation with their European partners.
Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil, this is the second time that now, because he's been elected more than a year ago, that we have this annual ritual at the start of the school year. It's all of the French ambassadors from around the world come to Paris, Emmanuel Macron speaking. When it comes to Europe, when it comes to his vision of an open Europe, Macron's staying on message in regards to what he said a year ago, but Europe has become more fraught in that time. Is he more isolated than he was 1 year ago?
He basically said that there were two main issues from last year, which was the crisis of Europe and the crisis of the multilateral system, of the international cooperative system with the UN, etc. And obviously, these were the two key pieces on which he wanted to be able to lean upon when he made this speech 1 year ago. So these crises are important for him. I'm not sure he's isolated, but he did say it clearly that there is a crisis, there are tensions. He did insist on the fact that, for instance, on migration, it used to be the case that there was a migration crisis in Europe a few years ago. But right now, if you look at the numbers, there is no migration crisis. If you look at the flows,
but there is a
political crisis.
The political crisis.
It's becoming a political football.
And some news outlets reporting it today as Emmanuel Macron leading the liberals versus Hungary's Viktor Orban leading the illiberals. Do you agree with that?
I would say it's what both Macron and Orban would like you to think, that kind of very clear-cut, polarized thing. I suspect it's a bit more complicated because you have a lot of liberals in Europe who don't really agree with all of the plans of Macron. And I suspect that there are quite a few governments also who are not illiberal, but who want to take into account the fact that some of their public opinion is not satisfied with the way Europe is going. And actually, that's something that Macron himself is saying, that we can't be satisfied with the way Europe is working. The question is, do you think that the solution is for Europe to work differently, or do you think the solution is to work without Europe, outside of Europe? And I think Macron had a good point today when he said it's funny how Orban or other leaders like Salvini don't like Europe except when it serves their purposes and their interests. Well, all of a sudden they think Europe is cool. And Brexit is kind of an exception. All those illiberal or populist forces, they don't really want to get out of the EU.
All right, and we'll have, I guess, a first test for Emmanuel Macron on the European stage coming up in some 6 months' time when we have European elections. Many thanks, Manuel Lafont-Rapnouil of the European Council on Foreign Relations, for joining us.
Thank you.